So today, we're going to have a look at the entire life of Nolan Grayson, who is also known as Omni-Man. So Nolan Grayson was an alien Viltrumite born on the planet Viltrum. His father, Argol, was the Viltrumites' leader. When he was very young, his father was killed by a Viltrumite traitor known as Thaddeus, who no longer believed in the Viltrumites' violent ways. Nolan was too young to remember anything about his father, and his true heritage was hidden from the records in order to hide him from the Viltrumite enemies, as their enemies were trying to wipe out the entire bloodline of Argol. After the death of Argol, another Viltrumite took charge and became their leader. He was specially created to be the strongest Viltrumite, and his name was Thrag. The Viltrumites were then organized into the Viltrum Empire led by Thrag. In his youth, Omni-Man signed up to conquer planets for the Empire, and he was so successful that he went on to command his own unit. About 100 years ago, before the start of the main story, Nolan fought against an alien called Space Racer. Space Racer was surprisingly strong, and he had a mysterious gun with him that was even able to kill Viltrumites. So Nolan decided to trap him, and he ended up burying him alive on an asteroid from where he could never escape on his own. Nolan also went to a very distant planet in space in order to conquer it for the Empire, but when he got there, he found that the planet is inhabited by a beastly species called Ragnars. Ragnars were extremely strong, and their claws and teeth were strong enough to tear out Viltrumite skin easily. Nolan realized the threat that Ragnars posed to the Viltrumite Empire if they were ever used against them, so he reported it to their base. And the Viltrumite Empire ended up blocking the sun of the Ragnars planet, which ended up freezing the entire planet along with all the Ragnars. Later, when the Viltrumite Empire was attacked by the Scourge virus and the virus killed 99.9% of the Viltrumites, as a result, the virus depleted the Viltrumite population down to less than 50. Because of their low numbers, the Viltrum Empire decided to work with a different strategy for conquering planets. So by taking advantage of their long lifespans, they decided they should infiltrate a society first and weaken the chance of it resisting their takeover. So with this new strategy, Nolan took on the mission to conquer Earth and then flew to the planet Earth to accomplish his task. On Earth, Nolan adopted the last name Grayson to appear more human. He met a woman named Debbie, who soon became his wife. Meanwhile, Cecil set Nolan up as Omni-Man, who became Earth's newest and most powerful superhero. So after getting married, Debbie gave birth to Nolan's son, Mark Grayson. Over the years, Nolan continued his battles with supervillains, which led him to his original encounter with the Guardians of the Globe, the world's premier superhero team. Although he did not join them, he later worked with them. He also met Art Rosebaum, a costume maker for superheroes who designed his Omni-Man costume. He told all of his human friends, including Art, Cecil, and even Debbie, a false story of why he was here on Earth. Okay, so instead of going briefly through events of Season 1, I will just discuss the main points from there, because if you guys are watching this video, you must have already seen the first season, so I don't think there is any need to talk about it again. So over the years, Omni-Man battled many villains to protect Earth, and while raising Mark, he revealed to him that one day he would receive superpowers just like him. Nolan also told Mark his false origin story. Later, when Mark received superpowers in high school, Nolan introduced him to Art, who made Mark's costume after Mark chose the superhero name of Invincible. First, Mark and Nolan stopped the Flaxans. Nolan was later abducted and taken prisoner by Flaxans. Somehow, they managed to neutralize his powers, but he regained them and led a revolt, causing damage to their entire dimension. After living 8 months in the Flaxan dimension, he escaped to his world and told Mark and Debbie about it. One day, Nolan decided to start his final plan of taking over Earth. So while Mark was sleeping, Nolan sprang his true plans to prepare Earth for a Viltrumite takeover. He delayed a false call to the Guardians' base, and after all of the Guardians of the Globe arrived, Nolan slaughtered all of them, including the Immortal, who told Nolan that he never liked him, and Nolan replied, "The feeling was mutual," to the Immortal's dead body. After the death of the Guardians of the Globe, the demon detective questioned Nolan and listed out suspects. He attended the Guardians' funerals and then headed home with Mark. He contemplated what he will do for Mark's birthday with Debbie. Mark and Nolan watched a movie after Mark's friends left. The next day, Nolan practiced on how he would tell Mark about his real origin, but became frustrated in the process. He attempted to do so while Mark was in the kitchen, but Mark refused to listen. Later, Nolan saved a carnival from a monster until he was interrupted by the Immortal, who he had killed before. Mark arrived to Nolan fighting the Immortal, in which Nolan impaled the Immortal and bisected him. After Mark witnessed this, Nolan revealed to Mark his true Viltrumite origin. Nolan stated that the Viltrumite race had a perfect society after killing off the weak. Nolan stated that anyone who resisted takeover was killed off and asked Mark to join him in taking over the planet. Nolan also reveals that Mark would live for thousands of years and everyone Mark loves would die. But Mark refused to let him take over Earth. Mark began to get into a dispute with Nolan and the duo battled one another. Nolan punched Mark through a building, killing thousands of people. While arguing more, Nolan claimed that Debbie meant nothing to him. Mark called him a liar, stating that he loves his mom, but Nolan rebuffed him, saying that he's telling him the truth for the first time. Nolan pummeled Mark through various locations around the world. Nolan mocked Mark and asked him what would Mark have after he's lived long enough. Mark revealed that he will still have his father. Nolan prepared to kill Mark but decided to spare him. He flew into space, crying while realizing that he actually loves his son and his wife. After realizing he loved Mark too much to kill him, Nolan decides to take over another planet, hoping to lessen his sentence for deserting the Viltrum Empire. He arrives to a planet called Traxa, and he learned that the Traxans had a short lifespan of 9 months, and that the oldest rules the entire planet. After revealing that he has lived for thousands of years, Nolan became their new ruler without having to fight his way up. He later sent a Traxan to get Mark to come to Traxa. The Traxan's mission was successful, and Omni-Man meets Mark again. Mark clenches his fist, as does Omni-Man, who is also prepared to attack him. But then suddenly, Mark starts crying and Nolan embraces him. Mark asks him to come back to Earth, but Nolan refuses. Nolan states that what he's done can't be undone and he must stay on Traxa. Nolan explains to Mark how he got to Traxa and leads Mark to his private chambers. Nolan reveals to Mark that he has a new mate, Andressa, and he has a child with her. Nolan goes on to explain that his son's purple skin will have him killed because the Viltrumites consider a genetic flaw a weakness, and his time on Earth has changed him. He also asks for Mark's help in defending Traxa from the Viltrumites. Soon the Viltrumites arrive and Nolan asks that Mark takes Andressa and his son to safety. Nolan fights and disembowels Lucan, believing he had killed him. He rushes back to take Andressa and his son back to safety. He arrives to see the 2 other Viltrumites that came to slaughter the Traxans. Nolan becomes enraged and takes it out on his son until he sees the Viltrumites and attacks them. He saves Mark from being attacked by one of them. Nolan and Mark would injure the duo, with Nolan nearly killing the 2. But he is ambushed by Lucan, who revealed himself to be alive after his disembowelment. He breaks Nolan's spine and passes out. Nolan is then taken prisoner but asks Mark to read his book before he's taken off. After he was taken away and while his back injury was healing, he shares a cell with a prisoner of an unknown alien race. He notices something wrong with Nolan, and Nolan reveals to him that he misses his wife. He attempts to escape, but his plans are stopped by Craig. Craig informs that Nolan is in full health now, so he will now be put to death. Craig inflicts damage on Nolan and has 2 other Viltrumites take home back to his cell. On his way back, he notices Alan and wonders why he is here. Alan communicates with him telepathically and assures him that he will talk with Nolan again. Alan later speaks with Nolan about the coalition of planets, Mark's role in the war between the 2 factions, and Alan's plans to free Nolan. Nolan is reluctant at first until Alan tells him of Telia and how the Unopans won't allow their union. Nolan tells Alan of his wife and how his love for her is against Viltrumite customs. He befriends Alan and Nolan decides to go with Alan's plan, when a Viltrumite arrives to kill him and Nolan informs Alan. While the Viltrumites were attempting to kill Nolan, Alan breaks out from his prison cell, frees other prisoners and arrives to his aid with Battle Beast. While the battle ensues, Alan punches a hole into the prison while taking advantage of his ability to breathe in the vacuum of space. Alan is attacked by a Viltrumite, but Nolan intervenes. The duo readies a punch and kills the Viltrumite, gushing his brain matter in space. Alan becomes worried because he believes they will send more Viltrumites, but Nolan reveals that there are less than 50 pure-blooded Viltrumites in the universe and that there won't be any arriving to the scene. So Nolan reveals to Alan the origin of the Viltrum Empire and how they became an unbeatable race. Nolan also reveals that the Viltrum Empire will likely turn Earth into a breeding camp. Then Alan grabs his gear and the duo head to Taliskria. He goes to Alan's apartment and interrupts Alan and Telia's moment. She fires at Nolan with a weapon, though not having any effect on him. The next day, they go to see Thaddeus, and Nolan reveals to Thaddeus information about the Viltrumites. Thaddeus also reveals that he is a Viltrumite and that he didn't realize he was the only Viltrumite to rebel. Thaddeus asks that the duo go on a mission for them, revealing that the Viltrumites have a spy in the coalition. Thaddeus states that the duo only report to him and sends them on their way. Nolan and Alan head to an asteroid belt looking for a gun belonging to a being, Space Racer. Nolan states that he battled him hundreds of years ago and he believed Space Racer died. They find the gun and as soon as they attempt to grab it, the gun flies away to the asteroid where Space Racer was trapped. So Space Racer turns out to be alive. And it shocks Omni-Man as well as Alan, because they never expected that someone can survive trapped in an asteroid for 100 years without any food. So Nolan and Alan hold him down until Space Racer shoots his gun, causing a chain reaction. But after a brief scuffle, Nolan and Alan convinces Space Racer that he has changed, and Space Racer heads with Taliskria with them. Thaddeus congratulates the duo on their mission because Space Racer is a very strong ally. Thaddeus sends Omni-Man and Alan on various missions such as retrieving the Ragna and listing the aid of other allies. Some missions they were successful, while others didn't go well, and after all the missions, Nolan and Thaddeus discussed Nolan's worries about the war. Thaddeus reveals to Nolan that he created the Scourge virus. Thaddeus also reveals that he created a stronger version of it and he won't hesitate to use it again if they are close to losing the war. Thaddeus then sent Nolan and Alan to Earth to get any allies who could fight in the Viltrumite war. Omni-Man and Alan met Mark and he asked that Mark join him in the war against the Viltrumites. Next, Alan and Nolan would go see Tech Jacket at his space station. They recruit him and Nolan heads to see his wife. Nolan apologizes for what he said with Debbie not wanting to hear it. He leaves it to Oliver's room and asks that he comes to Taliskria with them. Oliver accepts and they leave on a Taliskrian spaceship until they are ambushed by Conquest, Lucan, and an unnamed Viltrumite. Conquest grabs Nolan. He's overjoyed that he gets to kill Nolan and headbutts him. While Oliver is battling Lucan, Nolan intervenes and chokes Lucan. The Viltrumites then unleash a conquered race of alien and Oliver runs out of breath, so he goes to a habitable planet. Nolan rushes to see where Mark and Conquest are. He arrives with Oliver to see Conquest dead and Mark disemboweled, nearly dying from the battle. Nolan tends to Mark's wounds and buries Conquest. Over the time of Mark healing, Nolan uses the time to know Oliver better on a personal level. Months later, Mark fully heals from his injuries and Nolan reveals to Mark that Mark killed Conquest. The trio head back into the fight and head to Taliskria to assist in the war effort. Soon after Omni-Man and his sons return, Thaddeus prepares the coalition and its allies for the final battle at Viltrum. Thaddeus leads the group to planet Viltrum, but Thaddeus is ambushed by a Viltrumite woman. Battle Beast smacks her with his mace, and soon Thrag also attacks with some Viltrumites. Space Racer arrives with the Ragnars and they commence battle. Anissa grabs Nolan and attempts to suffocate him. He attacks her and Thaddeus grabs Mark to go with his plan. Nolan follows and grabs Mark, noticing that Mark isn't going as fast as Thaddeus and him. They charge into Viltrum and successfully destroy the planet's core. After the planet explodes, Nolan is subdued by Viltrumites but is released after a shockwave. He sides himself with Thaddeus, but soon Thrag attacks them. Thrag was in extreme rage, and he grabs and rips out the head of Thaddeus. Looking in shock, Nolan readies himself with Alan to fight the remaining Viltrumites and Thrag. So Thrag attacks Mark and almost killed him, but Nolan intervenes to save his son. Thrag reveals to Nolan that Thaddeus killed Argol, Emperor of Viltrum, and sent the Empire into disarray. Nolan reveals that he doesn't care and that the Viltrumites deserve extinction for their galactic tyranny. Thrag headbutts Nolan until Battle Beast intervenes, but Thrag throws Battle Beast aside and continues his assault on Nolan and Mark. He then releases Nolan and attacks Mark. Nolan rushes to Mark's aid, only to be impaled and disemboweled by Thrag. Both Omni-Man and Invincible are on death's door, and they are left floating in space. Thrag decides to let the duo live, and they retreat from Viltrum. 2 weeks later, Omni-Man recovers from his injuries and sees Oliver in a stasis tank. Alan reveals to him that there is no Viltrumite activity in the galaxy. Mark believes that the Viltrumites wouldn't have let Nolan and him live unless they wanted to hurt them. Mark believes they went to Earth, so Tech Jacket, Nolan and Mark head to Earth. Mark heads out of the spaceship with Nolan following him. Thrag reveals himself to the duo. Mark attempts to fight, but Thrag suggests they talk. Thrag offers a truce in exchange that the Viltrumites take over Earth. Mark refuses, but Thrag explains that they will hide among Earth's inhabitants and interbreed with them before announcing their takeover. Mark reluctantly agrees, thinking back on what could happen if he didn't. After confirming their agreement, Thrag flies off while thanking them and ending the Viltrumite war. Mark leaves to go see Eve, and Nolan and Debbie talk. A heartbroken Debbie begins crying after remembering old feelings. Nolan goes to her and she talks about how she wishes things to be the way they used to be. Nolan says that they will never be because he won't hide secrets from her again. Omni-Man then visits the Pentagon and realizes that he must leave Earth again. So he reveals to Mark and Eve that him and Debbie will be going to Telescria to work on their relationship. In Telescria, he notices Oliver crime fighting and they head to Debbie. Alan asks to see Nolan, as Alan is concerned with pressure from the Coalition to kill the Viltrumites off. He sends Nolan on his own to a new place with Debbie and Oliver. The next morning, Alan calls Nolan and Oliver and asks Oliver to leave. Alan reveals that he's going to handle the Viltrumites on Earth by dispensing the Scourge virus into the atmosphere. Nolan becomes angry after hearing what Alan plans to do, and as a result, the two battle. Nolan condemns Alan for suggesting such a plan, since it's similar to what the Viltrumites did to Alan's home planet. Alan rebuffs by saying that it'll stop that incident from happening again. Nolan launches Alan into space, and Alan injures Nolan until Oliver arrives. Oliver lands a low blow on Alan until the Coalition military arrives. Alan explains what he plans to do with the virus, and Oliver sides with him, much to Nolan's shock. Nolan explains that the Viltrumite will change while on Earth, because Earth will change the Viltrumite way of thinking, as it did to him. Oliver disagrees as he states that humans are selfish and are just as violent as Viltrumites. Nolan rushes to Oliver, but he can't hurt his own son. Alan punches Nolan into his apartment house and Debbie condemns him, mistaking him for trying to take over. The Coalition military arrives and they arrest Nolan, but Nolan is soon released after Alan realizes the error of his ways. Alan then sends Nolan back to Earth to check on the Viltrumite situation. When Nolan and Debbie arrive to Earth, they find out that Mark is dead, which was a big shock for them. But Mark appears after some time, stating that it was a clone that was killed by dinosaurs to fool everyone into believing that Invincible died. After some time, Cecil asks to talk with Omni-Man. Cecil believes that Nolan must still be punished for his first battle with his son, so Cecil gives Nolan exile and states that he will have to stay on the Guardian's moon base. He also asks that he keep an eye on the Viltrumite warship. After Cecil left the moon base, Nolan and Debbie prepare to have an intimate moment. However, Thrag ambushes with intent to kill Nolan. Seeing his wife almost being launched into space, he headbutts Thrag and rushes to save his wife. He manages to get her into an emergency airlock and continues his battle with Thrag, while being confused as to why he broke their truce. Nolan continues to say that he poses no threat to Thrag, and Thrag decides to let Nolan know his origin before he kills him. Thrag reveals that Nolan is the son of Lord Argol, who is the former emperor of the Viltrum Empire. Thrag also reveals that he won't let Nolan rule because he is a traitor. Nolan argues that he doesn't desire to rule, but Thrag decides that Nolan must die anyway. Thrag severely injures Nolan until Craig stops him, who is accompanied by Thula, Lucan, and Anissa. Nolan lands a blow on Thrag, and the four asks why Thrag is attempting to kill Nolan. They also discover Nolan's heritage and turn on Thrag. Together, they beat the crap out of Thrag for keeping this a secret and for trying to kill their emperor's son. They attempt to kill him, but Nolan asks that they let him live. The four obey and they bow to him, symbolizing his new role as emperor. Nolan gives a brief speech during his inauguration, citing that the Viltrumites should welcome the change from their time on Earth. He leaves to heal and visits Thrag in his holding cell. Thrag suggests that Nolan kills him, but Nolan refuses, arguing that those are the old ways of the Viltrumites. After fully healing from his injuries, Nolan brings Thrag before other Viltrumites to serve out his sentence. But instead of killing him, Nolan decides that Thrag is to be exiled. So Thrag leaves the Viltrumite warship, and Nolan relays the message to Alan, much to Alan's frustration. Nolan also sees Mark and they head to the moon. Mark reveals to Nolan that Eve is pregnant with his child, and Nolan congratulates him, and Mark heads back home after they discuss other topics. Afterwards, Nolan and Debbie would have Mark and Eve over for dinner. Eve accidentally reveals that she is pregnant to Debbie after Nolan asks Mark to tell Debbie. To see how strong they are, Omni-Man and Invincible engage in an arm wrestling match. They are at a standstill until Nolan gains the upper hand after Mark is distracted. The result destroys the table, much to Debbie's anger. Later, Nolan goes to meet Mark after Eve's leg was dismembered. Nolan reveals to Mark that Monster Girl was found in space and she's in surgery. Anissa reports to Nolan that they know where Robot's location is. Another Viltrumite reports that one of his drones are on the moon. The Viltrumites head to the moon, and Robot reveals that he knows that Monster Girl is in their custody. Robot asks how she is doing, and Nolan reveals she is stable. Robot reveals that he knows about the Viltrumite mission to interbreed and asks that Omni-Man work with him. The duo come to terms on their truce and prepare to take their leave. Omni-Man stops Mark when he attempts to destroy Robot's drone. He tells Mark that he has allied with Robot, much to Mark's disgust. Mark attempts to convince his father to help him take down Robot, but Nolan refuses. Nolan explains that doing nothing is the best because doing something will put too many lives at risk. Then Anissa interrupts and Mark grabs her by her neck. Nolan calls for Mark, but he demands Omni-Man stays out of it. Mark lets her go after something he said, and Nolan is left wondering what's going on. Mark refuses to speak, and he left the warship. After learning Mark is leaving Earth, Nolan has a meal with Mark and Art. Nolan says his goodbyes to Mark before he and Eve take their child to Telescria. After this, Invincible was teleported to a different timeline by a mysterious creature, where he lived for some time, and there we got to see the old version of Omni-Man that came to conquer Earth. Then Mark soon returned to his original timeline, but in his own world, 5 years had passed and no one knew what happened to Mark or where he was for 5 years. So 5 years later, at the same time of his Invincible's return, Nolan teams up with the Immortal, Tech Jacket, Robot, Tula, and the other Viltrumites to stop the Technicians. During that time, Nolan and Robot become friendly with one another. Later, he returns to his home on the moon and reunites with Mark, who has returned after 5 years. Nolan also says hi to Eve and Terra before having a private chat with Mark about him and Robot being friends now. Suddenly, Anissa breaks in to try to talk to Mark, but gets attacked by Eve. Nolan starts to help Anissa up until Eve almost shouts out what Anissa did to Mark. Nolan gets confused, starts to strangle Anissa, but Mark says that nothing is her fault. Anissa starts to explain why she came, but Nolan tells her to leave. Later, Nolan takes Mark to see Robot on Earth, who tries to convince Mark of all the good he has accomplished in the last 5 years. Mark talks to Nolan privately in space, saying that he will never trust Rex despite Nolan's attempts to persuade him. Mark, Eve, and Terra then leave for their home after saying goodbye to Nolan and Debbie. Later, when Oliver was killed by Thrag, Omni-Man goes to his funeral. There, Invincible starts beating Alan because it was his mistake that got Oliver killed. As they kept fighting, Omni-Man asked his wife if he should interfere in their fight, but his wife stops him from doing anything, and she tells him to take care of their grandkids and be a good grandfather. Later, Alan asks Invincible's help to finally kill Thrag, because Thrag has built a big army that they alone can't fight. Invincible goes to ask Omni-Man for help because Omni-Man is the new Viltrumite Emperor and he can command other Viltrumites under him. But Omni-Man refuses and states that he can't put the lives of his people in danger, and he himself was the person who let Thrag live in the first place, so it's all his mistake. But in the end, Omni-Man agrees to help in order to finally put an end to Thrag. Omni-Man and his team then starts attacking worlds that are under the control of Thrag, and soon they also reach the planet where Thrag currently lives. As soon as they reach the planet, Thrag attacks them with all of his forces, and his army turned out to be much more larger than they expected. He literally had thousands of hybrid Viltrumite children that he had produced in just 5 years, and all of his children were constantly attacking Omni-Man and his team. Their numbers were in thousands, and they destroyed Omni-Man's alien army, but they were not as strong as Omni-Man or as Invincible, and their bodies were breaking apart as they were hitting Omni-Man. Alan and Invincible were also easily able to kill dozens of them. But their sheer number was overwhelming, and most of them were just basically doing suicide attacks. Omni-Man and Alan tells Army to retreat, but Thrag follows them, which leads Thrag and his army to Earth. When Omni-Man notices this, he contacts all the Viltrumites living on Earth and commands them to be prepared for a battle against Thrag's army, and all of them instantly follow his orders. Before their final battle, Invincible and Omni-Man talk, and Invincible reveals to Omni-Man that Anissa raped him in the past and how deeply it affected him. But Omni-Man assures him that Anissa has completely changed now and she is a completely new person. Soon, Thrag's forces attack, and Omni-Man also attacks with his Viltrumite warriors and the military of Coalition of Planets. Omni-Man goes straight to attack Thrag, and an insane battle starts in space. Omni-Man and his allies are strong compared to Thrag's hybrid Viltrumite army, but their sheer number is proven too overwhelming for them. Thrag says that you should have killed me when you had the chance, and he then breaks Omni-Man's hand with a headbutt. He grabs Omni-Man and he was about to finish him, but then suddenly Invincible comes to save his father and attacks Thrag. But Thrag's children attacks Invincible, and Thrag returns to finish Omni-Man. Omni-Man breaks Thrag's nose, and Thrag compliments him by saying that Omni-Man is the only one capable enough to lead Viltrumites after him, but now he is going to take back his place as their ruler. So Thrag then stabs Omni-Man's heart with his arm, and by using his insane strength, he destroys Omni-Man's entire torso. Looking at Omni-Man's horrifying condition makes Alan, Invincible, and everyone else cry, and Invincible gets extremely angry and starts killing all of Thrag's children, and then he directly attacks Thrag. Eve comes out of the spaceship and rescues Omni-Man, who was still breathing. The doctors confirm that Omni-Man is still alive and they start treating him. Sometime after, when Invincible manages to defeat Thrag, he goes to see Omni-Man, who is in a very critical situation. Invincible says that his father will survive, but Omni-Man says that Thrag actually damaged his heart, and because of his damaged heart, his body is not healing properly, so he won't be able to survive for much longer. Omni-Man has a final conversation with Invincible as father and son, and in the end, he tells Invincible that he has to lead the other Viltrumites, and now he is their emperor. And with this, Omni-Man dies. So if you guys want me to make some more Invincible related videos, you can comment your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll be sure to have a look at them.